the Yasuo disaster, Ubisoft's nightmare. More and more shit is falling apart at Ubisoft as the Japanese government is now starting to crack down because of the historical inaccuracies in Ubisoft's latest Assassin's Creed Shadow. And now, why is this a problem, right? It's a video game. Wait, let me fix. I gotta fix my fucking. Why is this a problem, right? It's a fucking video game. Who cares, right? Wrong. Because they present the game as being mostly historically accurate, right? And so when you do that, and then most of what you're saying about in the game and most of what you're presenting is inaccurate or outright false or outright a deconstruction of what is real and true, and you're talking about the history of a country that takes its history very, very seriously, you're going to get in trouble. And that trouble is going to be very, very fun to watch from an outsider perspective.
All right, today's an interesting one because today we're talking about Assassin's Creed, Ubisoft,
Yes.
historical revisionism, and the Japanese government. There's more, a lot more, but the hook is that a wildly popular gaming franchise, that being Assassin's Creed, after a series of very unfortunate decisions, is actively being accused of cultural invasion.
Yep.
A problem that an official representative is now bringing in front of the Japanese Diete, which is their parliamentary government. His name, the representative, is Satoshi Hamada, and I'll get to that part later on, but the gist of it is that an entire historical narrative was crafted over the span of about 9 years, only to now be heavily disputed at the expense of a multi-billion-dollar franchise which attempted to build its latest entry almost exclusively off the back of a highly suspect body of work. In essence, Ubisoft has made their next entry in the Assassin's Creed franchise the focal point of a brewing international scandal. Great job. This is where I have to go through a sort of narrative arc, so to speak, and give the underlying context of the situation before expanding on how it all exactly fell apart. Assassin's Creed is one of the top grossing video game franchises of all time. It's on
Yeah, okay. It's in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's in the top 10. Yeah, sure. Okay.
the top 3 or the top 5, mind you, and it pales in comparison to franchises like Pokemon or Mario. But having surpassed 200 million copies sold with $4.6 billion total revenue, it's one of the most successful entertainment properties on Earth with no signs of slowing down.
Yep.
Just to highlight that point, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the latest entry before Shadows, which is the one we're talking about today, sold over 20 million separate copies, making it the highest grossing entry in the series, period. As a franchise, like
Not to mention all the
personally being a
microtransactions and
diehard
shit.
fan of the original trilogy with main character Ezio, Assassin's Creed is more successful now than ever before.
Honestly, though, like as successful as the franchise is, I think it's fucking disgusting that it's like the poster boy for microtransactions in single-player games.
Making it a focal point in the video game landscape as
Ubisoft
Ubisoft
games in general,
progressively
and EA.
increases their marketing and development budgets year after year after year, with notable success while doing so.
Yep.
Sure, they have their failures at times, but Assassin's Creed isn't one of them, and barring any sort of unexpected consequences, this latest entry, that being Shadows, would seem very likely to continue that trend.
Yep.
Maybe. For anyone who isn't already aware, Assassin's Creed Shadows is set in feudal Japan, which really isn't surprising at all after a game called Ghost of Tsushima basically copied the formula and sold almost 10 million copies over 4 years.
I don't think they copied the formula. I think it had a lot more in common with something like Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War. But, you know, there were very clear inspirations taken from Assassin's Creed for Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War, so I can understand why that would be stated.
As a PlayStation exclusive, people have been asking for a game about feudal Japan. Ubisoft have progressively expanded their repertoire of locations for the franchise, and all things considered, it seems like a perfect time for the franchise to make that jump. However, if you're going to make a Japanese-themed game, you probably shouldn't piss off Japanese people.
Yeah.
And that's where Ubisoft...
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the weirdest things. Like, you're making a Japanese fucking Assassin's Creed game, and then one of the main characters isn't Japanese.
epically dropped the ball.
It's so weird.
In May of 2024, Ubisoft unveiled the official trailer for the game, and pretty much immediately...
Not to mention, like in all previous Assassin's Creed games, you didn't play as historically significant characters. You played as random people that weren't in the history books, which makes sense since you're playing as either one side or the other of a secret society. right? So it's like it makes no sense for you to play someone that is known in history. Was Ghost of Tsushima made by Westerners but beloved by the Japanese? Yes, because it was incredibly faithful to the story and the culture, and so the Japanese fucking adored it. Funnily enough, the SJWs on Twitter fucking hated it, which was always it's always interesting. And yet the same SJWs who hated Ghost of Tsushima are gurgling Ubisoft penis, even though the Japanese actually are really disliking this game
Immediately
and
afterward,
everything
things
they hear
started
about
to
this
get
game.
a little bit weird. The story was set to feature two main protagonists, one male, one female, like before, but the male protagonist was determined to be Yasuke, who is,
Yeah,
quote, the first black samurai and referred to elsewhere as the first foreign born samurai as well.
yeah.
This is where the controversy starts because, according to an interview with game director Charles Benoit conducted in Xbox GameWire, quote, we're at the end of Sengoku era, in a turning point of Japan history. Assassin's Creed is well known for its depiction of the history and accurate recreation of the world, and it's what players can expect with Assassin's Creed Shadows. We're showing real historical figures, such as Oda Nobunaga, and a lot of events that happened during that time, so you're not only playing in feudal Japan, but learning about this fantastic time period. Also, we're giving the opportunity to the players to live not just one, but the two best fantasies of Japan, the samurai and the shinobi.
Yeah, except you're, playing as a samurai that even at the time, he was the only thing we know is that he was an attendant of Oda Nobunaga. Now, we know that attendants would, sometimes carry weapons and armor and own houses, and so they were practically samurai in their own right, right? So as much as he might have functioned as a samurai, nobody looked at him as a samurai. Like this is basically the samurai were the knights of Japan, right? Of feudal Japan. They were their knights. They were nobility. When this would be like if in Kingdom Come Deliverance, which is set in a fantasy version of medieval Poland, you were playing as a black guy. It would be completely out of the setting. It would be so silly to do that.
End quote.
It would make no
On its
sense.
face, that's pretty good. However,
Is it?
opinions rapidly took a turn for the worse when the true atmosphere of the game started taking shape, with
Oh my God,
examples like this
this
cropping
scene.
up from the gameplay trailer and getting plastered all over online messaging boards and social media.
Not while I have breath in my lungs and a blade in my hand.
Trap music. Not to mention American trap music behind, Japanese-esque themes. It's so stupid. It's this idea that every black person is African American. And yes, I've dealt with people who genuinely believe that, who will come to Europe and look at somebody of dark complexion and say, "Oh, hey, look at that, an African American." And it's so stupid. Would he not have made better shinobi due to natural camouflage? He was said to be significantly stronger than any other samurai of his time, even by like actual. There's only like 4 or 5 excerpts that we have from Oda Nobunaga talking about him. But like the reason why Oda Nobunaga gave him weapons and armor and his own house was because Yasuke, and this is something that is well established throughout history. People of African descent tend to be very physically strong, whereas people of Japanese descent, especially in feudal times, when there wasn't so much traveling and so much mixing of the genomes, were much smaller and not as physically strong. And so the result was a man, Yasuke, who was sold as a slave in Japan. And if I'm not mistaken, Oda bought him and made him his attendant because Yasuke had the strength of 10 men, basically. He was the strongest man in the city wherever he went. So he made him a swordsman. He made him a warrior. He made him his bodyguard. Like that makes sense. This isn't somebody who should have been the main character of an Assassin's Creed game, especially not the first Assassin's Creed game that is set in feudal Japan. People wanted to play as a Japanese samurai, not as Yasuke, for this game. I do think that it would have been absolutely awesome if they had made a fantasy game set in feudal Japan where you played as Yasuke. I think that would have been kick-ass. I don't think Ubisoft would have been the right person to do it because this is the result.
I said kill him. I'll wash away his failure with your blood.
For anyone who didn't notice there, the background track is basically hip hop infused Asian battle music, which
Yeah.
absolutely does not match the time period, the atmosphere, or the subject matter, except for one
DLC
particular
like
rare. I'll
in
skip
Tyranny of King Washington in AC3. Well, to be fair, the Tyranny of King Washington in AC3 is stated to be a universe where the Apple of Eden corrupts Washington into being something that he never would have been otherwise. So, like all of the arguments about how it's historically inaccurate, it goes entirely against the character of Washington. Yes, that's the point. He has been corrupted by the Apple of Eden, and throughout the whole story, the Apple of Eden makes him think that he's in control when he's really not.
over the smaller stuff here and get
Like
right to the
that's
main
the whole point
issues,
of the
but the
story. So I
general
think that that's
consensus
different.
around this game began to rapidly sour, especially in mainland Japan. See, Yasuke, the main protagonist and the quote first African samurai, has rapidly ascended the rungs of
God,
popularity and
Assassin's Creed
recognition in
combat
the
just gets
West,
worse and
but
worse
not
with
so much elsewhere
each
in the world.
generation, doesn't it?
Yasuke is the subject of a Netflix animated series now. He has multiple media mentions. There's a Broadway show about him, even slated for
Yeah.
2026. And he also shows up in other video games as well, like a boss fight in Neo 2 called the
Ooh,
Obsidian Samurai.
that's actually
And pretty
badass.
much all of that recognition.
But like, I think it's okay in Neo because Neo is clearly fantasy. Like, there's no historical accuracy in Neo. The most is that people show up who have some amount of historical value, but like Obsidian Samurai, and he's just this fucking giant carrying a great sword and just overpowering you completely.
Boss
Like,
fight
okay,
in
that's
Neo
badass.
2
It's like that's
called the
fine.
Obsidian Samurai. But
When
pretty
you're
much
trying to make
all
a
of that
title built on historical accuracy, you can't be doing this shit. And as much as they're trying to say now that they weren't trying to make it historically accurate, they absolutely are. That is absolutely the point of Assassin's Creed. They wanted to be at least partially historically accurate. They kind of deviated from that in Origins and Valhalla. I think it's called Valhalla. Assassin's Creed, is it Assassin's Creed Valhalla? I'm never sure. Um, but they tried to deviate from that to go more the fantasy side of things, and people didn't like it because people like when Assassin's Creed has some amount of historical
That
value.
recognition stems from a particular historian, a historian named
Oh yeah,
Thomas Lockley. This is where
this
things get
clown.
strange. Pretty much every modern Western mention of Yasuke tracks back directly in some capacity to Thomas Lockley. For the prior examples I even gave myself, the Smithsonian article referring to Yasuke as the first black samurai quotes Lockley directly, referencing his book, and that very same book, released in 2019, is the basis for almost every modern depiction of Yasuke that I could even find.
Yep.
Thomas Lockley is the premier historian associated with Yasuke, but the incredible popularity of Assassin's Creed and the anger at inaccurate portrayal of Japanese feudal society has kicked off a controversy that may undermine Lockley's entire body of work,
Yep.
as it forces Ubisoft to openly apologize and causes a never ending debate online about whether or not Yasuke was ever even really a samurai. Just to get this out of the way.
Yep. The Japanese government, from what I understand, is actually going in depth and actually studying and bringing up as much history as they can to try and figure out who Yasuke really was.
Right now, I don't personally have a stake in all of this. Assassin's Creed, to put it very bluntly, has never been tied to reality in my mind, and for a perfect
That's stupid. That's a stupid argument to make.
example, we can look at Assassin's Creed 3, which conveniently took place in revolutionary America. Yeah, I don't actually think that the half Mohawk Indian assassin fought side by side with George Washington.
Oh my God. The whole point of it isn't that you're playing as a real character. You're playing as a character that this is an alternate universe, right? Where most of the things that are happening are what happened, but then there's also the assassins and the Templars trying to control things from the shadows. That's why you play as somebody who isn't historically established.
Washington to recover an alien object. I'm not going to sit here and complain about historical accuracy. when the entire franchise is about a secret league of athletically superpowered time travelers fighting another secret society over extraterrestrial artifacts. Frankly, the fact that Yasuke existed as a sort of blank slate historical character that was in fact a real person, but we don't know all that much about him, kind of makes him perfect as a narrative blank
It really
canvas,
doesn't.
especially when he existed in close proximity to significant historical events. However, that's my personal
He would have been much cooler as a boss fight in the game.
opinion, and when it comes to Thomas Lockley, personal opinion goes entirely out the window. Hopefully, everyone can follow along with this part. I'll do my best to make it as straightforward as possible. Yasuke, increasingly popular in Western media with growing recognition across entertainment properties,
Hmm.
didn't always hold the same level of recognition. Right now, if you go to his Wikipedia page, there's a pretty sizable entry, but back in 2014, the entry was just a tiny fraction of the size.
Right.
Except if you go to the edit history for his Wikipedia page, you find something very interesting, and that is a
Yeah, it's all
particular
by Thomas
user
Lockley.
named Totori Tom, who has made sizable edits to the page, the sources, and the information contained within it. From one of his larger edits, quote, "This is the second in a series of edits I will carry out following a study of his life and times. All will be properly referenced when I get the chance." End
Yeah.
quote. And if you look at the actual profile of Totori Tom, you see, quote, Totori Tom is Thomas Lockley, a faculty member at Nihon University College of Law.
Basically, he made an essay, and then instead of referencing it properly, he just edited the Wikipedia page
Tokyo, Japan.
and referenced
His
his
interests are
paper.
primarily Japanese history related, end quote. That may seem innocent for the moment, or insignificant rather, because any profile on Wikipedia can write anything it wants in the bio section.
Right.
But Thomas Lockley is listed on the Nihon University faculty page, and the account Totori Tom was adding his papers and his book as page sources before the work was even published. Here's where it gets really strange. Speaking to Time magazine discussing the life of Yasuke in reference to the Netflix anime series, Lockley had this to say, quote, "There's no record, but tradition holds it that Yasuke was the one who took Nobunaga's head to save it from the enemy." Continuing later, "Yasuke, therefore, by escaping with the head, could have been seen and has been seen as changing Japanese history." End quote. That's no small thing. He acknowledges, in the briefest of ways possible, that there's no actual evidence, but goes on to say
Yeah.
that Yasuke has been seen as changing Japanese history.
Yeah, by who?
However,
You?
if you look at the Japanese version of his book, not the English version, it holds an entirely different atmosphere. Please understand, I don't speak Japanese, nor could I find someone who can translate for me at this particular time, so I used Google and various different transcription tools.
Okay,
These are
let's
highly
see.
imperfect, but the differences here are so profound, I don't see how they could possibly fit together based purely on mistranslation by Google, so here it is.
All
If
right.
you're capable of a better translation, please feel free to drop it down below in the comment section. Quote, "According to a family claiming to be descendants of the Oda clan, Yasuke is said to have smuggled Nobunaga's head and sword out of Honaji Temple to prevent them from falling into enemy hands." Further down, "There are several problems with this theory. First, no source, whether Yasuke was involved or not, mentions where Nobunaga's
Mhm.
head ended up or not. Froyce's letter is the only source that mentions Yasuke's participation in the battle, but it also makes no mention of Nobunaga's head. If Yasuke had brought the head back to Nanbanji, Froyce would have mentioned it. Second, escaping from the middle
That's actually a very good point. The idea that no one talked about it is a very, very big tell on whether or not something is real. There is the chance that it wasn't talked about at the time specifically so as to, spare Yasuke from suffering reprisals and to spare the Oda clan from being, pursued, but it's still sketchy.
of a burning temple surrounded by many enemy soldiers would have been extremely difficult without the added task of carrying, in addition to one's weapons, an incredibly large and unwieldy object, a human head. End quote. That is a very different tone than what he
But
puts
yeah,
forward in Time magazine. When publishing for a
in
Japanese
Time magazine, he basically states it as a fact that yeah, he did this, whereas in the Japanese tome, he states that some people say it, but there's no evidence, and then he reinforces that there not only is no evidence, but it is a very difficult feat to pull off.
audience, he expresses that it's incredibly unlikely to be true and highlights his own doubt about the subject matter.
Yeah.
But when talking to a Western audience, he says that Yasuke, quote, "has been seen as changing Japanese history." Hopefully, everyone can kind of see the problem. As if that's not enough, and the tipping point, at least for me, on Lockley's own credibility, in May of 2024, an article and interview in the Japan Times was published pertaining to the controversy around whether or not Yasuke was ever even a samurai at all, which said, quote, most telling to Lockley, however, is that no reputable Japanese historian has raised doubts about Yasuke's samurai bona fides, including Sakujin Kirino, who served as a fact checker for African samurai and is one of the country's foremost experts on the 1582 Honnoji incident, for which Yasuke was believed to be present. End
Huh.
quote. That's a very big deal.
Yes.
One of the country's foremost experts on the 1582 Honnoji incident, and he was a fact checker for Lockley's book over the authenticity of Yasuke being a samurai with no disputes. That's pretty important.
Yes.
Except it's a lie. Sakujin Kirino publicly on Twitter published a statement
Get that out of the way. When the Japanese version of Nobunaga and Yasuke, based on the original work by Thomas Lockley, was published in 2017, the translator, Yoshiko Fuji, asked me to read and give my opinion, so I gave a few opinions. It was just that, and it wasn't something as grand as a fact check.
read, quote, when the Japanese version of Nobunaga and Yasuke, Oda Publishing, based on the original work by Thomas Lockley, was published in 2017, the translator, Yoshiko Fuji, asked me to read it and give my opinion, so I gave a few opinions. It was just that, and it wasn't something as grand as a fact check, end quote. After which the Japan Times updated their article, removing the claim by Lockley that Sakujin Kirino had served as a fact checker for African samurai. One is a fluke, two is a coincidence, three is a pattern. Thomas Lockley appears to have been editing the Yasuke Wikipedia page as far back as 2015, citing his own work, which had not even been published yet. He appears to be telling different versions of historical events, at the very least portraying them in radically different ways, depending on his audience, Western versus Japanese. And he appears to have directly lied about the authenticity of his book, using an appeal to authority, as it's called, by claiming a certain expert fact-checked that work before the expert themselves had to come out and clarify that was not true, really. One is a fluke, two is a coincidence, three is a pattern.
Yeah,
just
bro
in
was
case
lying.
for anyone still on the fence, here is Lockley in his own words discussing the book that he wrote. Shout out to Vast Establishment on Reddit for discovering this particular interview.
This new book of yours might read to many like a novel, but to my understanding, you're not a novelist?
No, I'm not. I did originally write an academic book of this, which was published in Japanese, and that was, I think, 2017. So the book which you would find in front of you, African Samurai, is a much more
Why is bro stuttering so much?
readable version, less academic, far more narrative, though it's still based on the exact factual history. It's just simply not full of references and other things like that.
Just to recap that, he says, quote, the book which you find in front of you is a much more readable version, less academic, far more narrative, though still based on the exact factual history. However, later on, when the host, Jingyi Li, who's a PhD candidate cultural historian of 19th century Japan, go figure, questions the biography, referring to it as more historical fiction, he replies by just brushing it off immediately.
And as we talked about earlier, many may read this book as a novel because of, well, apart from.
If he had just stated it was a novel and then try to put it off as, real texts and reality and historical fact, I don't think any of this would have been bad. Because if he had just said, this is a novel, this is based loosely on the idea of Yasuke, who, we know existed. We have these 5 sentences in the writings about Oda Nobunaga. So we know he existed. And so I've written this novel about him, the way I imagine the story might have gone with him, it would have been absolutely fine. And then Assassin's Creed Shadow would have been based off of this character, not the real Yasuke, the character as portrayed in African Samurai, written by Thomas Lockley. It would have been completely fine. But this really all just comes down to the fact that Thomas Lockley really, 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 really wanted to portray himself as an expert on Japanese history, and so instead he just really, really wanted to just add a character that really didn't belong in it.
the very specific historic background. There's also a lot of depictions of the characters, I guess,
Yeah.
inner development.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
its category on Amazon and Goodreads is biography.
Yeah.
Well, personally, I feel like it's more of a historical fiction. So, how would you define the nature of this book?
Well, there's very, very little there which is actually fiction. There are various
Hmm.
scenes which were added because we knew that they might have happened. There's one scene where Yasuke is watching a hawking session, and we know that Nobunaga was almost obsessed by hawking and hunting with birds. So
Yeah.
therefore, it's highly likely. I mean, we can say probably we're 99% sure that Yasuke would have seen that. So we did make up the occasional scene just to give a little bit of atmosphere.
He's like Neil Druckmann of historians. That is such a good way to put it. I am at a loss for words. That is just such a good way to put it. Thank you, Maggie.
If you
You
like.
should be proud
I
of
should
yourself for
clarify
that
here
one.
Thomas Lockley, in the aftermath of this new scrutiny, seems to have fully deleted all of his social media profiles. He has distanced himself entirely from the controversy, but the controversy is not done with him. Posted
Oh
by
boy.
Satoshi Hamada as a serving member
Bro
of the
tried to
House of
run away.
Councillors in Japan, which is the upper portion of the Diete, though he seems to be more like a fringe candidate than anything else, rather than a central figure. Quote, "We're looking for your feedback. We were consulted by a French game company about a historical alteration of Japan.
Yeah,
The content of the
Ubisoft.
consultation is shared below in images. We've also quoted a post that appears to point out the problem with the game in question. We would like to hear your specific requests and opinions." Further down, "Thanks for the information about Assassin's Creed Shadows and Yasuke. Keep
Yeah.
your research focused. Primary source information on Yasuke, Yasuke information in Thomas Lockley's book. Please request the National Diete Library to investigate this matter. Secretaries of Satoshi Hamada's office."
Wait, that's pronounced diete? I would have said it's diet. I would have just read that National Diet Library and I was like, I had read ahead and I was like, National Diet Library? What the fuck?
There it is. Ubisoft, with Assassin's Creed Shadows,
Yeah.
has decided to focus a portion of their newest title on a character named Yasuke. But Yasuke, despite many people vehemently claiming that he was in fact a samurai, is not the subject of historical consensus. Many experts believe he was merely a retainer or a servant or some form of lesser caste, while others, namely Thomas Lockley in particular, assert that he was not only a samurai but a legendary samurai that was, quote, been seen as changing Japanese history, end quote. Meanwhile, Ubisoft, presumably relying on his work as one of the narrative pillars here, given that the game centers on Yasuke as an active samurai who participated in a lot of combat routinely, and Thomas Lockley is the only person pushing him forward as a
Yep.
hero story from an academic perspective in Japanese history, has now had to issue an apology that reads, quote, "We have put significant effort into ensuring an immersive and respectful representation of feudal Japan.
Yeah, I'm sure you have.
However, our intention has never been to present any of our Assassin's Creed games, including Assassin's Creed Shadows, as factual representations of history or historical characters," end quote. And yet, this is the same company,
Yeah, but you claim that it's historically accurate
once
to a
again
degree.
referencing the Xbox GameWire interview, that said they are showing real historical figures.
Yeah.
So you're not only playing in feudal Japan, but also learning about this fantastic time period.
Exactly.
Why would you be learning from things if they're telling fictional stories? Like, this doesn't jive. To be perfectly clear, I can actually see why they chose a narrative blank slate for the purpose of storytelling. I don't personally look at Assassin's Creed and think, where's the historical accuracy? But when you make a game about a certain culture,
But it should be grounded in historical reality. It is a historical fiction, but it should be grounded in historical reality.
which Assassin's Creed has routinely done, why would you choose the only example of a samurai who isn't even agreed on as being a samurai?
Oh,
as
because
your
he's
main
black. Like, because he's black. That's it. That's the reason. Ubisoft suffers from something that is very American, even though they're European and French, which is this idea that diversity consists exclusively of whatever is not the majority, right? So in America, that would be whatever isn't white. And in Japan, it would be whatever isn't Japanese. So they have decided to include this level of diversity in the cast of the game, not because it would make the story better, but because it would add to its diversity. And because it would add to its diversity, they have decided that it is better for the story and for the game, even though it really isn't. And all it does is piss off the Japanese customers, which the game should be treating as the target audience. Yasuke should not be the main character. The main character should be a fictional Japanese samurai that they create to be the protagonist for the game so that you can play as that character, you can have your own character, you can make your own decisions, and then, Yasuke shows up and he's next to Oda, and, maybe you see him fight and he fucking ragdolls everybody who comes anywhere near him. Or, hey, you try to fight him and he's this absolute monster who you can barely keep up with because of how strong he is, but you eventually beat him because you're just the better fighter, and he's, I don't know, man.
Character.
There's
And
so
then put
many
it
other ways that this could have been done without, the forced diversity angle. It's just sad.
cringy hip hop filter over that culture's
Also,
music.
yeah,
Why
the
would
the
you
hip
make it
hop
so
was
that when
just cringe.
Assassin's Creed is finally set in Japan, you don't even play as a Japanese warrior half of the time? Instead, focusing on an outsider who brutally slaughters real Japanese samurai all over the open world, when every single previous Assassin's Creed game focused on a character that actually related to the culture of origin. In the Revolutionary War, the assassin was half Mohawk. In the original trilogy, Ezio Auditore was Italian. In Valhalla, Ivor was a Viking, etc., etc.
Yep.
Why are you breaking that trend now? At the end of the day, the Yasuke disaster is the story
Because, and this is the thing, they're not looking at Yasuke as the African samurai. They're looking at Yasuke as the African American samurai. That's why there's hip hop. That's why he's got all sorts of things that honestly don't relate either to Japanese culture or, let's be real, African culture.
of a historian who centered his entire body of work on portraying a little known Japanese figure as some sort of legendary hero, twisting his words all over the place depending on who was in the audience at that particular time. And Ubisoft went and made half of a AAA game about it. In response, scholars, critics, regular players, pretty much everybody online has been weighing in on whether or not his character was ever really a samurai, whether or not he should be the main focus of the game, and why Ubisoft might have made all of these creatively baffling decisions in the first place. But at the end of the day, I don't really have those answers. My opinion, Ubisoft wanted to score some diversity points.
Yep.
That's really just what it boils down to. Yasuke happened to fit a pretty convenient narrative template while also scoring them those diversity points and allow them a real historical figure who stands out dramatically in feudal Japan
Damn,
for
she got
some
cooked.
of the wrong reasons if you take this controversy at face value. And they use that as their starting point and unwittingly rope themselves into a culture war for all of the wrong
Oh,
reasons
yeah.
at the worst possible time, as people accuse each other of either rewriting history maliciously or being viciously racist, depending on which side of the political aisle you're on. That's it. That is the Yasuke controversy explained, and none of it will likely impact the game at all, which is almost
Oh yeah, the
certainly
game's
sell
gonna suck
between
no
10
matter
and
what.
20.
Like, we saw plenty of combat. Like, Assassin's Creed combat is so, like, pathetically kidified. It's ridiculous. Like, you'll be surrounded by four guys with swords, and three of them will stand still and just watch as you pound the fourth guy into sand, and they'll kind of just stand there drooling on themselves, just like, huh. It's like,
Million
bruh, do
copies or
something.
more, becoming wildly
He's
successful
fucking
regardless
up
of what we
Billy.
talk about
Help
today.
Billy.
That's
Do
just
something.
kind of how the world works now. But now you know the story.
Yeah.
If you want to support the channel, there's links down below. A special VPN deal. Everybody could use that for those interested. Patreon and locals if you support what I do and want to financially support future videos. And more, but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always,
Yeah.
thank you all for watching. Question everything, and have a nice night.
Yeah. The whole Yasuke thing is just, it's just them trying to score diversity points, even though, they would have scored those diversity points just by, making a game set in Japan with a Japanese character. As is, it just feels like they're pandering, and they're pandering to all of the wrong people, because they're pandering to a very small subsect of people who doesn't even play video games. So, with all that being said, make sure to give Upper Echelon some love. But I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, and cheers.